Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into waters that have swallowed ships whole and driven sailors to madness. Or at least, that's what the legends claim. You're standing on a weathered dock somewhere on the Norwegian coast, and the fog is rolling in thick enough to taste, all salt and secrecy. The planks beneath your feet are slick with seawater, and somewhere in that grey wall of mist, something ancient is waiting. We're asking a question that's haunted humanity since we first lashed logs together and called them boats. Is the Kraken the most fearsome sea monster in mythology? Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if it were real. Good thing you're safely tucked in bed while I do the dangerous work of wading through centuries of sailor testimony, ancient tablets, and the occasional bishop who really should have stuck to Sunday sermons. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop your location and local time in the comments. There's something perfect about knowing we're all scattered across time zones, but we're all here together in the dark, chasing monsters. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a small room lit by a single tallow candle, and spread before you on a heavy wooden table is a map that smells of salt and old ink. It's 1539, maybe 1562. The exact year doesn't matter as much as what you're seeing. This is Olaus Magnus's Carta Marina, and it's one of those Renaissance masterpieces where the known world bleeds into the imagined one so gradually you can't tell where fact becomes fiction. Your finger traces the coastline of Scandinavia, following the careful Latin labels, and then you see them, the sea monsters, not tucked politely in a corner as decorative flourishes, but sprawling across entire sections of ocean, their bodies coiled and vast. One creature near Iceland looks less like an animal and more like a mountain range with teeth. The cartographer didn't sketch these as myths or maybes. He drew them with the same confident strokes he used for Copenhagen and Stockholm. Here's the thing about those old maps that historians still debate. Were they warnings or were they advertisements? Some scholars argue that cartographers intentionally populated unexplored waters with monsters to discourage competitors from seeking new trade routes. Others insist the mapmakers were simply recording what sailors reported, and those sailors weren't known for exaggeration, at least not about the things that could kill them. You run your finger over the words, "Hic sunt dracones," here be dragons, and wonder what it must have felt like to be a captain staring at this map, knowing your voyage would take you past those inked serpents into waters where the map itself admitted ignorance. The candle flickers, and in that brief shadow, the creatures on the map seem to move. You blink and they're still again. But the illusion was perfect, and you understand something the mapmaker knew. Fear doesn't need proof, it needs possibility. Every blank space on a map is an invitation for the mind to fill in its own monsters. The ocean in the 16th century wasn't just dangerous because of storms or starvation. It was dangerous because it was genuinely unknown. When your longest voyage might take you 6 months out of sight of land, when you couldn't radio for help or check a weather satellite, the line between possible and impossible got real blurry, real fast. You notice something else. These aren't all the same creature. There's what looks like a serpent with a horse's head, something with tentacles wrapped around a ship's mast, a fish large enough to swallow a rowboat whole. The medieval and Renaissance imagination didn't settle on one ultimate sea monster. It created an entire ecosystem of terror. Each culture that touched the ocean added its own nightmare to the collective catalogue. The question you're holding now, centuries later, is whether any single creature from that bestiary earned the title of most fearsome, or whether fear itself is too personal, too culturally specific to crown a champion. Your candle burns lower. Outside this little room, you can hear the creak of ship rigging in a harbour, the low calls of sailors preparing for a morning departure. Someone laughs, but it's the kind of laugh that has an edge to it. Gallows humour from men who know the statistics. 1 in 3 ships that left port might not return. Not all of those losses were monsters, of course. Most were weather, disease, navigation errors. But when a ship vanished without a trace, when not even wreckage washed ashore, the human mind needed an explanation bigger than the wind changed. And that's where the Kraken enters our story. Not yet with that specific name, but with the idea that has always powered it. Somewhere in the deep, there's something large enough and hungry enough to erase you completely. The map before you doesn't answer whether the Kraken is the most fearsome. It only promises that the question matters, because somewhere past the edge of this parchment, in waters your candlelight can't reach, something is waiting to show you exactly what fearsome means. You blow out the candle. Time to find out. You're standing on a cliff on the western coast of Norway, and the year is sometime in the late 12th century, let's say 1180, give or take a winter. The wind up here doesn't just blow, it attacks, pulling at your cloak and making your eyes water. Below you, the sea is that particular shade of grey-green that seems unique to northern waters, and it's moving in long, slow swells that suggest something massive and alive. You're not alone. Beside you is a scribe in the service of King Sverre of Norway, and he's trying to write with hands gone numb from cold. He's documenting what the fishermen are saying, and what they're saying sounds impossible. It rises like an island, one fisherman tells you, his Norwegian accent thick enough that you have to lean in to catch every word. His name is lost to history, but his testimony isn't. We thought it was a skerry, a rock just breaking the surface, and we rowed toward it thinking we could rest there. Then it moved. He's not a young man, this fisherman. His face is weathered to leather, his hands scarred from decades of working nets and lines. These aren't the kind of men who scare easily, and yet his voice drops when he describes what happened next. the island sank. Not slowly, like something wounded, all at once, like something deciding to leave, and the water it displaced nearly capsized us. The scribe writes this down, his quill scratching across parchment. King Sverre's court is building what will eventually become the first written records of what we'll later call the Kraken, though that name won't appear in Norwegian waters for another 500 years. The Old Norse word they're using is hafgufa, the sea mist or sea reek, and it refers to something so large that fishermen mistake it for land. Historians still debate whether these accounts describe a real phenomenon, possibly a massive whale or a cluster of jellyfish creating an optical illusion, or whether they're the birth of a mythology that perfectly captures the terror of Arctic fishing in waters where visibility drops to nothing and your boat is always one wave away from disaster. Another fisherman approaches, younger, with the kind of energy that suggests he's trying to prove himself to the older crew. The whales won't go near certain waters, he says, and this detail catches your attention because it's specific in a way that pure fantasy usually isn't. You see them feeding, hunting, and then they reach an invisible line and they turn. All of them. Like there's something they know that we don't. This is the kind of observational detail that makes you wonder. Whales do have complex behaviors, migration patterns, hunting grounds. Is it possible they avoided certain areas because of something real? Volcanic vents, underwater canyons where the currents turn strange. And the fishermen interpreted that avoidance as evidence of a super predator. The scribe finishes writing and looks up at you. Do you believe them? He asks, and it's a fair question. You're in an era before the scientific method, before the idea that claims require reproducible evidence. But you're also in an era when the ocean genuinely was the last great unknown on Earth. No one had mapped the seafloor. No one understood how deep it went or what lived in those depths. The fishermen weren't stupid. They were working with incomplete information in an environment that could kill them 100 different ways. Here's a quirky detail that often gets left out of Kraken stories. These early Norwegian accounts don't emphasize tentacles. The hafgufa is described as enormous, yes, and dangerous, absolutely. But the image of writhing arms pulling ships down comes later, possibly influenced by eventual encounters with giant squid that washed ashore. The original Kraken, if we can call it that, is more about sudden displacement, about the ocean itself rising up with malevolent intent. It's less monster, more force of nature with an appetite. You watch the sea a while longer, looking for any sign of movement beyond the normal roll of waves. The fishermen return to their boats, preparing nets for the evening catch. They'll go out onto those same waters tonight, despite the stories, because that's what survival requires. Fear doesn't pay for bread or warm a home through a Norwegian winter. But respect for what you can't see, can't predict, can't fight, that's different. Respect keeps you cautious, keeps you watching the water for the moment when an island decides to stop being an island. The scribe packs up his materials and you turn from the cliff. The Kraken hasn't been born yet, not really. It's still just stories from men who smell like fish and salt, accounts that a king's chronicler bothers to write down, because even royalty understands that some truths live in fishermen's warnings. Whether it's the most fearsome sea monster remains to be seen, but standing on this cliff, watching those grey-green waters, you understand why it's a contender. Some fears don't need elaborate mythology. Sometimes terror is just the ocean being larger than you can imagine, and hungrier than you want to believe. You move forward in time slightly, still ancient, but now you're in the Levant, somewhere around the 6th century BCE, and a Hebrew scholar is showing you passages from what will become the Book of Job. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook, he asks, translating from the Hebrew, and it's clearly a rhetorical question. The text describes a creature with scales like shields, breath like fire, eyes like the dawn. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified, the passage continues. The sword that reaches it cannot avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. This isn't a creature you fight. This is a creature that exists to remind humanity of its place in the cosmic order. Historians still debate whether Leviathan was based on a real animal, a crocodile perhaps, exaggerated through poetic license, or whether it was purely symbolic, representing chaos and the untamable forces of nature. Some scholars point to linguistic connections between Leviathan and the Canaanite sea serpent Lotan, suggesting a shared mythological ancestry that predates the Hebrew texts. Others note that nearly every ancient culture with access to large bodies of water develops some version of a chaos serpent. The Egyptian Apep, the Norse Jormungandr, the Hindu Vritra. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. What makes these ancient sea monsters different from the later Kraken is their cosmic significance. Tiamat and Leviathan aren't just animals that happen to be large and dangerous. They're theological concepts given flesh and scales. They represent the moment before creation, the chaos that gods had to overcome to make an ordered universe possible. When a Mesopotamian priest described Tiamat, he wasn't warning sailors about navigation hazards. He was explaining why the world exists and why it's always one catastrophe away from sliding back into primordial soup. You're descending now, not in depth, but in time. The Norwegian coast fades and you find yourself somewhere infinitely older. It's the 3rd millennium before Christ, and you're in ancient Mesopotamia, standing in a temple in Babylon, where clay tablets line the walls like a library written in wedge-shaped cuneiform. The air here smells of incense and river mud, that distinctive scent of the Tigris and Euphrates that built civilizations and inspired some of humanity's first written stories. A priest gestures you toward a tablet, his fingers tracing the symbols as he recites from memory. This is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and the monster at its heart makes the Kraken look like a recent innovation. Her name is Tiamat, and she's not just a sea monster, she's the sea itself, the primordial salt water from which all things came. The tablet describes her as having multiple heads, though the exact number shifts depending on which version you're reading. Some scholars say 7, others 11. A few suggest she was so vast that counting her heads was meaningless. She birthed demons and dragons, and creatures with scorpion tails and the bodies of lions. When the younger gods decided to overthrow her, it took Marduk, the most powerful among them, armed with the 4 winds and a net woven from the sky itself, just to have a fighting chance. And even then, the battle nearly destroyed the cosmos. Here's what strikes you as the priest continues. Tiamat isn't evil in the way later monsters will be. She's maternal turned wrathful, the ocean as a mother who creates life and then, when disrespected, reclaims it with extreme prejudice. Her fearsome nature comes not from her appearance, though multiple heads certainly help, but from her fundamental role in existence. You can't negotiate with the ocean. You can't reason with the force that carved continents and fills 3/4 of the Earth's surface. Tiamat is fearsome because she's inevitable, and the only way to defeat her was to literally rip her body in half and make the sky from one piece and the earth from another. Even in death, she remains everything. You notice something else. These ancient monsters are almost always female or genderless, representing the ocean as a womb that can nurture or destroy. The Kraken, when it finally emerges in Norwegian waters centuries later, will be referred to with male pronouns more often than not, a subtle shift in how humanity thinks about sea monsters. Tiamat creates, the Kraken consumes. Both are fearsome, but the flavor of that fear is different. One threatens to unmake creation itself, the other just wants to eat your boat. Standing in this ancient temple, surrounded by tablets that predate the Viking Age by 3,000 years, you realize that the question of which sea monster is most fearsome might be a question about what kind of fear we're measuring. Is it more terrifying to face a creature that wants to devour you, or one that represents the fundamental chaos from which you were briefly borrowed and to which you'll inevitably return? The Kraken can sink your ship. Tiamat can unspool reality itself. The priest notices your thoughtful expression and smiles. All rivers flow to the sea, he says in Akkadian, and the sea is never full. Whatever name you give the deep, it will answer with teeth. You're in Bergen, Norway, and the year is 1752. You're sitting in the study of Bishop Erik Ludvigsson Pontoppidan, and the room smells like pipe tobacco and old books. The good kind of old books, leather-bound and well-loved. The bishop himself is a small man with intense eyes, and he's showing you his magnum opus. De første forsøg på Norges naturlige historie, the natural history of Norway. It's going to be one of the most controversial books published in the 18th century, and it's going to cement the Kraken in popular imagination in a way that medieval legends never quite managed. The fishermen are consistent, Pontoppidan tells you, spreading out pages of notes across his desk. I've interviewed dozens of them from different villages, men who've never met each other, and they describe the same creature. When it surfaces, it looks like a cluster of small islands. When it dives, it creates a whirlpool that can pull down ships that are a quarter-mile away. He's wearing his bishop's collar, but in this moment, he's talking more like a naturalist than a clergyman. The Enlightenment is in full swing, and there's a growing belief that the natural world can be catalogued, understood, reduced to entries in a great encyclopedia of existence. Here's the part that makes Pontoppidan's work fascinating. He's not just collecting folklore, he's trying to estimate the Kraken's size using geometric calculations based on eyewitness testimony. According to his notes, which you can read over his shoulder, the creature might be as much as 1.5 miles across. 1.5 miles. That's not a monster. That's a geological event with tentacles. He's calculated that its tentacles, when fully extended, could reach the mast tops of the largest ships in the Norwegian fleet. He's estimated that when it defecates, yes, he discusses this, the expelled waste creates fishing grounds so rich that sailors are tempted to linger in dangerous waters. You can't help but smile at that detail, because it's so wonderfully specific and so perfectly medieval in its logic. If the Kraken exists, surely it must defecate, and if it's as large as the fishermen claim, that waste would indeed attract smaller fish, which would attract the fish that fishermen actually want to catch. It's this kind of practical reasoning that made Pontoppidan's work influential despite the skepticism it generated. He wasn't writing fairy tales. He was trying to fit a monster into the Linnaean system of classification that was revolutionizing biology at exactly this moment. But here's what troubles me, Pontoppidan says, lighting his pipe and leaning back in his chair. The fishermen say they've stopped seeing it as frequently. 20 years ago, you'd hear accounts every season. Now, perhaps once every few years. He pauses, considering. Either the creatures are dying out, or they're moving to deeper waters. Or, and here he meets your eyes with the look of a man who knows he's about to say something that will make people laugh. They've learned to avoid human activity. That last possibility is the one that historians still debate. Was there ever a real Kraken? And if so, what happened to it? Some scholars suggest that Pontoppidan was documenting the last regular sightings of giant squid before they became extremely rare in Norwegian waters due to climate change or overfishing of their prey. Others argue that improved ship construction and navigation meant sailors were simply mistaking fewer natural phenomena for monsters. The scientific consensus is that Pontoppidan genuinely believed he was cataloguing a real species, and his methodology, interviewing multiple independent sources, trying to reconcile conflicting accounts, attempting mathematical estimates, was actually pretty sound for his era. Here's a quirky tidbit that often gets left out. Pontoppidan didn't just document the Kraken. His natural history of Norway includes entries on mermaids, sea serpents, something called a hafstram, that sounds like a cross between a seal and a dragon, and his personal favourite, the krakeas, or Kraken's ember, which was supposedly a glowing substance that appeared on the water when the creature was near. Whether this was bioluminescence from plankton or pure invention is anyone's guess. You stand to leave, and Pontoppidan walks you to the door. "Do you believe it's real?" you ask him, and he considers the question seriously. "I believe the fishermen believe it's real," he says finally. "And I believe that something in those waters has terrified experienced sailors badly enough that they risk being called liars by men who've never left sight of land. Is it a mile wide? Perhaps that's an exaggeration born of fear and distance. But is there something out there?" He looks toward the window, toward the harbour and the grey Norwegian sea beyond. "I'd be more surprised if there weren't." You leave the bishop's study with a copy of his notes tucked under your arm. The Kraken has evolved. It's no longer just fishermen's warnings scribbled in royal chronicles. It's been measured, calculated, given a quasi-scientific legitimacy that will carry it into the modern era. Whether that makes it more fearsome or less is a question you'll carry with you into the next waters. You're in the Mediterranean now, and the year has rolled back to somewhere around 750 BCE. Give or take a few generations, because Homer wasn't big on dating his work. You're standing on the deck of a wooden ship, watching the coastline of what will eventually be called Italy. And ahead of you in the strait is something that makes the Kraken look straightforward by comparison. You're approaching Scylla and Charybdis, and the genius, the terrible genius, of this particular myth is that you don't get to choose just one monster. You get both, and they're positioned specifically so that avoiding one means risking the other. The sailor beside you, let's call him Thales because he looks like a Thales, points to the cliff face on your right. Scylla lives in that cave, he says, his voice carrying the weight of someone who's navigated this strait before and lived to regret it. She has 6 heads on long necks, and each mouth has 3 rows of teeth. Homer said she barks like a dog, which undersells how absolutely terrifying that sound is when you're close enough to hear it. He's not exaggerating for effect. You can see the cave opening, a dark slash in the rock face, and there's something about its positioning, high enough to strike down at a ship, but low enough that you can't sail past without entering her range, that suggests whoever designed this myth understood tactical positioning. Then he points left to where the water is churning in ways that water shouldn't. Charybdis, he says simply. 3 times a day she swallows the sea, and 3 times a day she vomits it back up. You get caught in that whirlpool, it's over. The entire ship goes down, crew and cargo both. Not even wreckage survives because she pulls it so deep. You watch the water's movement and realize this isn't entirely mythological. The Strait of Messina, between Sicily and mainland Italy, does have unusual tidal currents, powerful enough to be dangerous to ancient sailing vessels. The myth didn't invent the danger, it personified it, gave it teeth and hunger and intention. Here's what makes Scylla and Charybdis so insidious as a measure of most fearsome. They're a binary choice where both options are terrible and you have to choose. The Kraken you can maybe avoid by staying out of certain waters or not sailing in certain seasons. Tiamat and Leviathan are cosmic forces that most humans never directly encounter. But Scylla and Charybdis, they guard a trade route. If you want to move goods between the eastern and western Mediterranean, you have to pass between them. The myth forces you to calculate which death you prefer. 6 members of your crew snatched and devoured individually, or everyone drowning together as the ship spirals into the deep. Odysseus, in Homer's telling, chose Scylla. He calculated that losing 6 men was better than losing everyone, and he hugged the cliff wall while Charybdis churned on his left. The text describes the moment with particular horror. The men were plucked from the deck while calling his name, and there was nothing he could do but maintain course and speed. They died knowing their captain had chosen their deaths as the lesser of 2 evils. That's a different kind of fearsome than the Kraken's sudden violence. It's the horror of conscious sacrifice, of having to look your crew in the eye while sailing toward the monster you've decided will eat them. Historians still debate what Scylla originally represented. Some suggest she was a real hazard. Rock formations that resembled heads on long necks when seen from a distance, combined with unusual acoustics that made the wind sound like barking. Others point to her as a symbol of the unavoidable costs of ambition, a monster that exists to teach the lesson that some passages exact a price regardless of how clever you think you are. The Odyssey is full of monsters, but Scylla and Charybdis are the only ones where intelligence doesn't help, where there's no trick or disguise that saves you. What's quirky about this myth is how it evolved over time. Later Roman writers, uncomfortable with the idea that heroes couldn't win, started inventing scenarios where Scylla could be defeated or Charybdis avoided through superior seamanship. But Homer's version is bleaker and, honestly, more realistic for anyone who's actually sailed dangerous waters. Sometimes there is no good choice. Sometimes the sea offers you death in 6 pieces, or death all at once. And the best you can do is pick the option you can live with, if you survive. You sail through the strait, and whether it's your imagination or something real, you hear a sound like barking echoing off the cliffs. The sailor beside you grips the rail a little tighter, and you understand something important about the Mediterranean tradition of sea monsters. They're not just descriptions of danger, they're navigation tools. Every myth encodes practical knowledge. Scylla and Charybdis become shorthand for dangerous strait with unusual currents. Hug the eastern wall, but not too close. Expect to lose someone if conditions are bad. The fear is a teaching method, a way to make sure the next generation of sailors respects water that has drowned better men than them. Is it more fearsome than the Kraken? That depends on whether you're more afraid of the monster you can maybe avoid, or the monster that guards the only path forward. You sail on, and the strait releases you into open water, and you're grateful for boring, monster-free ocean in ways you never were before.
You're in Japanese waters now,
somewhere off the coast of what will eventually be called the Wakayama prefecture. And the year is irrelevant, because this encounter could happen in the 1600s, or the 1800s, or last Tuesday. The sea is perfectly calm, unnaturally calm, and that's your first warning that something is wrong. The sailor at the tiller, an older man with white hair tied back in a traditional style, isn't relaxing into the good weather. He's tense, scanning the water like he expects it to attack. Umi-bōzu, he says quietly, and the word translates roughly to sea monk or sea priest. When the water goes still like this, when there's no wind but the boat stops moving, you watch for him. He reaches for a barrel lashed to the mast and pulls out a ladle. If he rises and asks for one, you give him a bottomless barrel instead. Never what he asks for, or he'll use it to sink you. This is where Japanese sea monster mythology diverges sharply from the European tradition, and it's worth sitting with that difference. The umi-bōzu doesn't have tentacles the size of ship masts. He's not measured in miles, or described in terms of how many villages he could swallow. He's described as humanoid, sometimes completely bald like a monk, sometimes just a massive shadowy figure that rises from calm seas. Some accounts say he's 10 meters tall. Others suggest he's large enough to tower over a 3-masted ship. But the terror doesn't come from his size. It comes from his rules. European sea monsters operate on relatively straightforward principles. They're hungry, you're food, don't get eaten. The Kraken surfaces, grabs your ship, pulls you down. Scylla snatches sailors from the deck. Even Leviathan, for all its cosmic significance, is described as something that consumes and destroys. You can understand the threat even if you can't defeat it. But the umi-bōzu operates on yokai logic, which means the rules are specific, sometimes arbitrary, and absolutely must be followed, or the consequences are immediate and fatal. The old sailor tells you the story of a merchant ship that encountered an umi-bōzu in 1803. He has the year because it became a famous cautionary tale. The creature rose from calm water and spoke to the captain. "Give me a barrel to scoop water with." The captain, either brave or stupid, refused. The umi-bōzu sank the ship by filling it with seawater, one methodical scoop at a time, while the crew watched. It took hours. They had time to realize their mistake, to beg forgiveness, to offer everything they owned. The creature ignored them and kept scooping until the ship went under. Here's what makes the umi-bōzu particularly unsettling. It's not always hostile. Some accounts describe encounters where the creature rises, observes the ship silently, and then sinks back beneath the water without incident. Sailors who treated it with respect, who remained silent, didn't point, didn't make sudden movements, survived to tell the tale. Others describe crews that tried to drive it away with noise or weapons, and were capsized immediately. The fear isn't just that it can kill you, it's that you don't always know what will trigger an attack. Historians still debate what the umi-bōzu represents. Some suggest it's a cultural memory of unusual wave phenomena or water spouts that appeared in inexplicably calm conditions. Others point to it as a personification of the psychological stress of sailing in the Pacific, where calm weather could leave ships becalmed for weeks, food and water running low, the vast, empty ocean in every direction. A few scholars suggest that umi-bōzu is what happens when a culture that believes in spirits and demons applies that worldview to the one environment that remains genuinely unpredictable: deep water far from land. What's quirky about the umi-bōzu is how specific the survival instructions became. Different regions developed different protocols. Some said you should throw rice into the water as an offering. Others insisted you needed to show the creature a bottomless container to confuse it. Still others claimed that absolute silence was the only defense, that the creature was attracted to human voices and would sink any ship where someone spoke above a whisper. The variations suggest these were actual strategies that different sailing communities developed, tested, and passed down. A kind of maritime folklore that doubled as practical superstition. You watch the water, and for a moment, just a moment, you see something. A darkness beneath the surface, too large to be a whale, too still to be a current. The old sailor sees it too and falls silent, and you understand that the instruction isn't casual advice, it's survival protocol. You don't speak, you barely breathe. The darkness drifts closer, then away, then deeper, then gone. The boat begins to move again, the unnatural calm breaking as a normal wind fills the sail. Is the Kraken more fearsome than that? The sailor asks once you're safely away, and it's a genuine question. A creature you can see coming, that operates on hunger you understand, or one that appears in good weather that might kill you or might not, depending on rules you'll only know if you survive to tell about them. You don't have an answer. You're too busy being grateful that you didn't do whatever would have made that darkness rise. You're in Newfoundland, and the year is 1873, and everything is about to change. You're standing on a beach in Logie Bay, and stretched out before you in the November cold is something that shouldn't exist. It's a giant squid, Architeuthis ducks, though it won't be formally classified for another few years. And it's massive enough that the local Reverend Moses Harvey has had to drape it over his bathtub for the photographs, because nothing else in his house is large enough to display it properly. You can smell it from here, a mix of ammonia and decay that makes your eyes water. 32 feet long, Harvey says, measuring it again because he still can't quite believe it himself. Tentacles could reach 55 feet when it was alive, possibly more. eyes the size of dinner plates, beaks strong enough to cut through steel cable. He's practically vibrating with excitement, and you understand why. For centuries, millennia really, sailors have been reporting encounters with massive tentacled creatures, and for centuries, scientists have been politely calling them liars. But here's the evidence, undeniable and increasingly pungent in the Newfoundland air. This specimen isn't the first giant squid ever recorded, but it's the first one that comes with photographs, measurements, and scientific documentation detailed enough that the skeptics have to shut up. Earlier specimens existed. A Danish naturalist named Peter Steenstrup described giant squid tentacles in 1857 based on fragments that washed ashore. But those were just pieces. This is the whole animal, or most of it. And Harvey is turning it into the scientific event of the decade. Here's what you realize standing on this beach. The Kraken just stopped being mythology. It's been demoted to zoology. That tentacled nightmare that Vikings whispered about, that Bishop Pontoppidan tried to calculate the size of, that pulled ships beneath the waves in 1,000 different sailors' tales. It's real. It's also dead. It smells terrible. And it's considerably smaller than the legends suggested. The largest confirmed giant squid ever measured was about 43 feet long, maybe 60 feet with tentacles extended. That's big enough to be absolutely terrifying if you encounter one while swimming, but it's not big enough to pull a full-sized sailing ship underwater. Historians still debate how much of the Kraken legend was based on actual giant squid encounters versus other phenomena. Some suggest that squid were only part of the story, that whale carcasses, unusual weather, seismic activity, and sheer human imagination combined to create a composite monster larger than any single animal could be. Others argue that the giant squid's documented behavior, surfacing at night, capable of attacking sperm whales, possessing strength wildly disproportionate to its mass, was terrifying enough to fuel the legends on its own. What's quirky about the 1873 discovery is how it changed the conversation. Before Harvey's squid, you had two camps. People who believed the sea held massive monsters, and people who thought sailors were drunk or stupid or both. After Harvey's squid, you had a new question. If something this big was real, and we didn't know about it until recently, what else is down there? The oceans suddenly became less about specific monsters, and more about the general principle that we were catastrophically ignorant about what lived in deep water. You ask Harvey the question directly. Is it still fearsome now that we know what it is? He considers this, looking at the creature that's starting to sag in ways that living tissue shouldn't. Different kind of fearsome, he says finally. Before, it was fearsome because we couldn't understand it. Now it's fearsome because we know exactly how little we understand about the ocean. This specimen washed up in shallow water. It was probably sick or dying. Healthy ones stayed deep, hundreds of feet down, maybe thousands. We don't know their hunting patterns, their migration routes, their population. We don't even know if this is the largest species of squid, or just the largest one we've caught. He's right, and you know it. The discovery of the giant squid didn't end the mystery. It opened new categories of mystery. It proved that massive creatures could hide in plain sight for centuries, that the ocean was deep enough and strange enough to keep secrets. And it raised a more unsettling possibility. If giant squid are real, if stories that sounded like pure fantasy turned out to be sober observation, what other myths are we getting wrong? You leave the beach as the sun sets, and you can't help but notice how the water looks different now. Before, the ocean was the place where monsters might live. Now, it's the place where monsters definitely live, along with countless other species we haven't discovered yet, swimming through an environment more alien than the surface of Mars. The Kraken has been caught, measured, and photographed. But the fear? The fear just got more sophisticated. You're back where you started, standing on a dock, fog rolling in, the question still hanging in the salt-thick air. Is the Kraken the most fearsome sea monster in mythology? But you're different now. You've travelled through time and culture, from Mesopotamian creation myths to Norwegian cliffs, to Japanese calm waters, to a Newfoundland beach where mythology became biology. And the answer you're holding isn't the one you expected to find. Here's the verdict. It depends on what you're measuring. If you're measuring by sheer size, the Kraken probably doesn't win. Tiamat in her various descriptions was large enough that her body became the sky and earth. Leviathan was described in terms that suggest something more like a whale than a squid. And blue whales, which definitely exist, can reach over 90 feet long and weigh 200 tons. The Kraken, even in Bishop Pontoppidan's most generous estimates, comes in around a mile wide when you count the tentacles. But historians mostly agree that was based on multiple sightings, misinterpreted as a single creature. If you're measuring by documented kills, you're in murky territory, because we're comparing legends to reality. Giant squid are known to attack sperm whales, and there's evidence of battles between the two species that left both animals scarred. But verifiable cases of giant squid attacking ships, extremely rare. Scylla and Charybdis, as personifications of navigational hazards, probably have higher body counts just because that strait was on a major trade route. Dozens of ships went down in those waters over the centuries, and while most were due to storms and human error, the myths persisted because the danger was real and recurring. If you're measuring by cultural impact, by how deeply the monster embedded itself in human consciousness, the Kraken does pretty well, but it's not alone at the top. Leviathan has theological weight, appearing in multiple religious traditions, and serving as a metaphor for chaos, evil, and the limits of human power. The Kraken has pop culture dominance. It's in movies, video games, rum bottles, and the collective imagination of anyone who's ever thought about deep water. But Tiamat has cultural staying power that predates written language, representing fears so fundamental they got baked into creation stories. If you're measuring by type of fear, things get interesting. The Kraken represents sudden, overwhelming force. You're sailing along, and then you're not, and there's no time to prepare or negotiate. That's one kind of terrifying. The umi-bōzu represents arbitrary rules and spirits that operate on logic you don't fully understand. A more insidious terror that comes from knowing you might do everything right and still die because you didn't know the secret. Scylla and Charybdis represent impossible choices where someone has to suffer and you have to decide who. Each fear has its own flavor, its own way of keeping you awake at night. Historians still debate whether the most fearsome question even makes sense when applied to myths from different cultures that serve different purposes. Norse/Scandinavian sea monsters were warnings from a fishing culture where the ocean was both livelihood and constant threat. Mediterranean monsters were navigation aids encoded as stories. Mesopotamian chaos serpents were theological concepts. Japanese yokai were spiritual entities that required specific protocols. Comparing them is like asking whether hurricanes are more dangerous than earthquakes. The answer depends entirely on where you're standing and what you're trying to protect. Here's what you know for certain after this journey. The ocean itself is the monster. Every specific creature, Kraken, Leviathan, Tiamat, Scylla, umi-bōzu, Charybdis, is just humanity's attempt to give that vastness a face we can understand. We can't fight the ocean as an abstract concept, so we create monsters we can name, describe, theoretically defeat, or at least avoid. The monsters are translations of a more fundamental terror, the knowledge that we're land creatures in a water world, and most of the planet's surface is filled with an environment that will kill us in minutes. The Kraken endures not because it's the biggest or the deadliest, but because it perfectly captures the particular horror of Nordic sailing. Something vast that rises from below, grabs hold, and pulls you into darkness. That resonated in Norwegian waters in the 12th century. It resonated in Bergen when Pontoppidan tried to measure it in 1752. It resonated in Newfoundland when Moses Harvey realized the legends had a biological basis. And it resonates now when we've mapped the ocean floor and confirmed that the deep is full of things strange enough to make mythologists look conservative. Is it the most fearsome? Probably not, because different terrors speak to different fears. But is it up there, in the pantheon of creatures that make humans think twice before venturing onto dark water? Absolutely. The Kraken earned its place not by being the biggest or the deadliest, but by being the most perfectly adapted to the specific fear it represents. The moment when the ocean stops being a surface you sail across and becomes a depth that reaches up to claim you. You stand on the dock, fog thick enough now that you can't see the water, only hear it moving with that patient, inexorable sound that oceans have. Somewhere out there, maybe a mile down, maybe 10 miles, things are swimming through darkness that would crush your bones in seconds. We've named some of them, we've photographed some of them. We've even figured out that some of the legendary monsters were just large squids having a bad day. But the question remains, what haven't we found yet? What's still down there, moving through pressure and cold and absolute darkness, occupying an environment more alien than the surface of Mars? The Kraken might not be the most fearsome sea monster in mythology, but it taught us the right question to ask. In an ocean that covers 70% of the planet and remains 95% unexplored, how can we possibly know what's swimming beneath us? The answer, of course, is that we can't. And that unknowing, that fundamental acceptance of our ignorance in the face of deep water, that might be more fearsome than any specific monster could ever be. The Kraken is dead, preserved in jars and museums. The myths have been catalogued, cross-referenced, traced to their origins. But the ocean is still here, still vast, still hungry, still keeping secrets. And that's the most fearsome thing of all. The fog is thicker now, wrapping around you like a blanket made of mist and memory, and your breathing has slowed to match the rhythm of distant waves. You've travelled far tonight, through time that stretches back to when gods fought monsters that became the world, through waters that have swallowed ships and sailors and secrets. Your journey took you to Norwegian cliffs, where fishermen whispered of islands that sank, to Mediterranean straits, where heroes chose which death they could bear, to Japanese seas, where silence might save you or might not, to a cold beach where myth became science and the questions only multiplied. The monsters are still there, in some form, in the depths where giant squid hunt sperm whales, in the stories that fishermen still tell when the weather turns strange, in the way even modern sailors feel their spine tighten when the water goes too calm or too dark. But they've become something different now that you've walked among them, listened to the people who believed in them, understood why those beliefs made sense in their time. Fear doesn't disappear when you understand it. It just changes shape, becomes something you can carry rather than something that carries you away. You're back in your own time now, in your own bed, the safety of walls and electric lights, and the knowledge that the nearest ocean is miles away if it's anywhere at all. The Kraken can't reach you here. Neither can Tiamat or Leviathan, Scylla or Charybdis, or the silent umi-bōzu rising from calm water. But they're still swimming somewhere in the space between history and imagination, between what we've proven and what we've feared. And they're waiting patiently, like the ocean always waits, with the certainty that eventually, inevitably, everything returns to the water. Let them wait. Let the monsters keep their mysteries. Let the deep hold its secrets a while longer. You've learned enough for one night, that fearsome is a question without a single answer, that legends are the way we make sense of things too large to understand, and that the ocean will always be more vast and strange